Evening, lads. How's everyone doing? Good. You can hear me okay, yeah? Sweet. Okay, so have you guys been to a nutrition talk before? No. Yes? No? Okay. So my name is Evan. I'm a dietitian. I happen to specialize in sports nutrition, and for some reason the lads bring me back here every year, so hopefully you find it helpful. Live this time, yeah. So, very brief introduction about myself. As I said, I'm Evan. I'm a registered dietitian. I'm a sports nutrition specialist. I specialize in particular in endurance sports. And my reasonably short career to date, I've been the dietitian for the Dublin Marathon last year, and I've had athletes in the last 2 Olympic Games. A fair cohort of athletes coming up in Paris 2024 Olympics and Paralympics in track and field, triathlon, and I work with quite a lot of professional cyclists and reasonably recent Ross winners. So it's pretty cool. I think it's pretty cool. I'd be biased, of course. I think it's interesting. If any of you guys are podcast listeners, maybe you are, maybe you're not. I have a podcast. It's on Spotify and all streaming platforms. It's the Fuel Better podcast. If you're bored or have a lot of spare time on your hands, or you're out on a long bike for a few hours at the weekend, it might pass a bit of time for you. You can find some information there. Anyways, I'll get on with the talk. And again, if any of you are on Instagram, eLynchFitNut, give me a follow. I post semi-consistently, not as much as I should. Okay, so I'm going to talk first and foremost about calories and calorie balance. And the reason I'm going to start with that is at all levels of cycling ability, any sporting ability really, most athletes come on board and they say, I'd like to optimize my performance, but also lose a little bit of weight. And those two goals are very rarely not happening at the same time. And it's really important that we understand the importance of calorie balance and how far we can push that both. Because generally speaking, weight loss and sports performance are massively antagonistic. You can generally do one or the other unless you carefully toe the line. Have any of you guys ever heard of relative energy deficiency before? Some of you have, some of you haven't. Basically, think of it as malnutrition, but for active people, okay? So if you're very active, let's say you go for a 4-hour bike, you whack out 2,000 calories on the bike, and I don't know, you don't eat enough at dinner, you skip dessert, or you're trying to be healthy, you might grossly underfuel. If you do that enough, you can get any one, maybe all of these side effects here. So I presume you guys can't read that. I'll give you a highline summary of some of the symptoms that I've seen patients of mine, ranging from first-time marathon runners to couch to 5K to professional, elite, international athletes, generally in endurance sports. Some of the initial side effects from underfueling in sports: menstrual dysfunction, infertility, osteoporosis. I work with some 20-year-olds who have osteoporosis. That's not supposed to happen. That can happen from underfueling. Immunosuppression, gut issues, hormone changes, generally poor performance, all those things as well. It has a pretty stark effect on the human body. Luckily, we have ways to avoid that. If you are male or female, we know exactly how many calories to give a person so that they don't experience any woeful side effects of trying to underfuel. So if someone is asking me, I'm trying to lose weight, or I'm trying to optimize my body composition, how much calories should I eat? This is what I'll tell them. For guys, it's 30 calories per kg of fat-free mass. I'll explain that in a second. For ladies, it's 45 calories per kg of fat-free mass. Fat-free mass is basically how much of you is not body fat. Okay, there's a couple of easy ways to establish that. You can do a skin fold test. If you're living in Dublin, you can probably do a DEXA scan. Most of you probably have a Tanita scales, or one of those scales that tells you your body fat percentage. If you know your body fat percentage, you can work out your fat-free mass and multiply it by 30 or 45, and that's how many calories you need to basically pay for your physical ESB bill, as it were, the calories required to keep your heart beating, keep your brain ticking over, all that jazz. That makes sense so far? Okay. Training costs then, that one can be a little bit specific. For cycling, it can actually be wicked straightforward. Do any of you guys have power meters? Some of you do, some of you don't. If you have a power meter and you're training, whatever your power meter says you've burned in training is exactly how many calories you've burned. So if you're trying to figure out how many calories do I need in training, look at your power meter and just eat that many calories. Otherwise, you can go by your watch, Garmin or Polar, pretty accurate, or you can do a VO2 max test. So not everyone needs to go into this level of minutia, but if you like numbers, maybe spreadsheets, maybe you like tracking your calories, this would be a pretty good place to start. So some examples then. If you have an 80 kilo athlete who's 10% body fat, he's doing 500 calories an hour and he's doing a 2-hour bike session, this might be the calories this person requires to pay for his ESB bill and pay for his training on that day, okay? Otherwise, if you have a female, 50 kilos, 20% body fat, and they're doing a 90-minute track session, they burn 670 calories, this is what they might need. So if we know the numbers, we know someone's ESB bill, we know their training requirements, if we want to help them lose weight, we simply work that out and take away 300 to 500. So for weight loss, for sports performance, you can be in a 300 to 500 calorie deficit and it won't impact your performance. So moderate weight loss is what we're looking at here. I understand that's an awful lot of numbers. The slides will be sent to everyone here. I'm easy to find as well if you have questions on it. But generally speaking, if you know your body fat percentage, you have a way of calculating your training needs, this is pretty straightforward to work out. Okay, I'm going to move on to carbohydrates. Can someone give me an example of a carbohydrate?
Pasta.
Yeah, pasta. He's actually a nutrition student, so he really should be getting the answer to that question. Sugar, yeah. Carbohydrates at their most simple. And can you give me an example?
Potato.
Spuds, yeah, fact. So carbohydrates also look like milk. They also look like bananas. They also look like honey or cereals of any description. Think of carbohydrates as the lifeblood of an athlete. They effectively pay the exercise bill. So you use carbohydrates to pay for exercise, as it were, and recover from exercise very effectively. If you're looking to see, well, how much carbohydrates should I eat on any given day, multiply your weight in kilos by 4 or 5. As an example, I'm about 80 kilos, okay? And if I were to start training again, I might need to eat 400 grams of carbs a day. Does anybody know how many slices of bread that is? We have 4, we have 5, a bit more. Any other guesses? We have 8, okay, any other guesses there?
Slice pan.
It's almost a sliced pan. It's about 34 slices of bread. That brings me to my next point. Most athletes, cyclists especially, because of the high training loads, underfuel woefully, especially when it comes to carbohydrates. And that can be a problem because you might find you get tired really quickly. You might find you don't recover very well. You might find you're wicked hungry and you have this insatiable appetite. If you don't get your carbs in around training, generally speaking, everything is much, much harder. And that's what most people get wrong first and foremost. So the needs for most cyclists on any given day vary from 4 to 12 grams per kg of body weight. If you're going doing a 4-hour, 5-hour, possibly a 6-hour bike, if you're an Ironman athlete, those requirements can become staggeringly high very quickly. Is anyone training for an Ironman here? Okay, crikey, got a bit of bread to eat. Spuds are an easier way to meet those needs. They're a little bit bulkier. Okay, do we have any questions so far? I know there's a lot of numbers there. No? We're all good? Okie doke. So when we look at exercise performance, we can generally surmise that when you're training or exercising, there's almost a linear improvement in performance all the way up to this many grams of carbohydrates per hour during exercise. So if you're doing sportives, you're doing stage races, time trials, whatever it might be, we can generally tell you that the more carbohydrates you eat, the quicker you're going to be, generally speaking. If you don't believe me, try it out. If you don't fuel in your sessions, do. You should be, generally speaking, 10 to 15% quicker. That's usually the difference we see in the research papers. All these yolks here, the gels, the powders, that's kind of the easiest way to achieve that. So 75 to 90 grams an hour is kind of where that dose-response relationship peaks out. If you are an ultra endurance cyclist, if you do those very, very long, say Mizzen to Malin type of things, or very long trail races, or again, you know, you're an Ironman athlete, there is evidence that tells us that having as much as 120 grams of carbohydrates an hour massively reduces muscle damage. So this graph here, this basically shows us muscle damage. And you can see the difference in 90 and 120 grams an hour in the markers for muscle damage. It almost totally stops your muscles breaking down. Anecdotally, I've had cyclists go and do 4-hour bikes on a Sunday. They try 120 grams of carbs, which would be, let me see, it would be one of these and one very chunky gel an hour. And I've had cyclists come back to me and say, yeah, I feel grand, I could do that again. They're totally fine. It's mind-blowing how much of an impact that can have. So generally, again, that trend of the higher you can go, the better, that generally holds true.
Sorry, is there a danger of is it possible, or is there a danger of overtaking carbs in a cycle like that?
Yep, good question. So for anyone that mightn't have heard that, is there a danger to overcarbing during exercise? Not really. So as a practitioner, I guess, if we're trying to help someone optimize their performance, and that is generally what we're doing, we want to get them to have as many carbs as they physically can in and around training. It'll generally only have a positive outcome. Even from a health perspective, there's more merit to over-fueling or having a really high carbohydrate availability right around training than not doing that. I actually covered in a couple of minutes, but in terms of, say, how your body uses the fuel, you're very insulin sensitive, your glycogen burning rate is much, much higher. The glucose gets burned almost instantly, so there's no real demonstrable health effects. You struggle to maintain stable blood sugar during exercise at the best of times. So the more you can get in, generally, the better it goes for you. Just some rough guidelines you could work with. And again, this is a slide that people generally find helpful, and you will get the slides. If you're doing an exercise session that's less than an hour in duration, you probably don't need to be too gung-ho on the carbs or the drinks or the gels. You'll generally get away with it. You'll typically have enough glycogen to last about 100 minutes of steady state work. So that's your mid-aerobic range type of work. You're not going to have to be too gung-ho if it's anything less than that. But if it's a tough session, if it's an FTP test, if it's repeat sprint efforts, I probably would go to 30 grams an hour. So those ranges there, stick to the lower end of the range if the exercise intensity is easy. If it's hard, go to the higher end of that range. That generally works well for people. If you find these products tough on your gut, and I don't know if some of you do, if some of you struggle with gels and things like that, a couple of heads nodding there, you might find it easier to start with something like an aqua gel or just a sports drink, a commercial sports drink like a Gatorade or an isotonic. They're generally much easier to hack because they're a lower concentration. You might graduate to something like an SIS Go gel, and then eventually to something like those chunkier Morton or Beta Fuel gels. So the more carb that's in a single unit, generally the harder it is to tolerate. So if you find these things make you a little bit sick, sports drinks are a good place to start and then build up from there.
Just on the gel, sorry.
Yeah.
Somebody was telling me before that if you take a gel, then you get a lull after a certain amount of time, and then you need to take another one, that it, it wears off. And keep taking to keep the energy up.
So the question was relating to taking gels, maybe getting a lull in energy and taking a gel again to prevent it or to pick your energy back up. That sounds like someone that's reacting to being tired as opposed to, I guess, getting ahead of it. And I can't click back here, but normally what I'd recommend to an athlete is they start fueling from minute 0. So it's a common mistake someone will make where they'll go into a 3-hour bike and they won't take anything until they're an hour in or an hour and a half in. At that time, their glycogen levels have already zipped way down. So you start from minute 0. Generally a gel every 30 minutes from the second you jump on the saddle is a good general heuristic. You shouldn't find that your you're kind of peaking and troughing there with your energy levels thereafter. It'll help keep you nice and steady. So if you are taking a gel and getting a lull, you've kind of missed the boat a little bit, and you're struggling to keep your blood sugar steady, basically. So tell your friend. So in terms of carb loading then, I just said I'd put in a couple of different examples. A couple of myths about carb loading. I get some people who are under the impression that they have to carb load sometimes a week in advance. Definitely don't do that. You'll end up looking like a tennis ball on race day. It'll be very ineffective. Or you'll be woefully constipated. One or the other, possibly both. Not good. We only need to go for 36 hours prior to your race. And a good heuristic would be think 36 beige. You want to keep your carb options generally a little bit lower in fibre the day before a race. So nothing like a big green salad or loads of brown bread. And the reason we do that is to minimise the risk of a stomach issue. It's more common in running and triathlon, less so on the bike. Nonetheless, ultra endurance events do raise your risk of having some tummy problems or toileting issues, and it's not exactly uncommon in cyclists either. So you're sticking to more so your white carbohydrates, as it were. And again, the longer the event, the more of a requirement to carb load. So again, for something like a multi-stage race, you might aim for that. I know in the Tour de France, some of the athletes might be aiming for intakes of 18, possibly 20 grams per kg per day of carbs, which is phenomenally, astoundingly high. If you're doing a sprint, you kind of only need to be around here. Anything 90 minutes or less, you don't need to go too mad with it. So that's generally doable. Do any of you guys have races coming up soon? You got a race? What have you got?
Sunday, triathlon.
How long is it?
It's spring.
Okay, so you're going to be up there.
I'm getting into the beige tomorrow.
Okay. What are you planning on eating? I hope you don't mind me asking. I know there's a crowd.
Plain rice, chicken and beetroot.
Beetroot. Okay, we'll come back to beetroot later on, but yeah, sounds like you're on the money. Pancakes, bananas, spuds, cereal, generally easy ways to get your carb intake up.
I have a question to you, Yor.
Go for
How
it.
do you cope with all the sweetness of all that you've taken over the season from everything? You come to a point that you have acidity reflux.
So you might find that you're getting some reflux issues after a while on the bike. Very, very common, to be fair. That could be an element of gut training. So gastric emptying, or how quickly your stomach empties things, can become worse as you exercise. There's some anecdotal research there to suggest that something like Martin might help you with that. The hydrogel should improve gastric emptying rate. Otherwise, it's just a case of training your gut. I have some slides on gut training coming up. But the other element of that question, the taste and texture fatigue maybe you're describing, where it's sickly sweet after a while, sometimes breaking it up with some solid foods, sometimes toast, fruit loaf, bananas, dates, that can be helpful, or Rice Krispie squares. I know some athletes, I actually had an ultra endurance athlete who used to bring spuds on a long bike. You know, whatever works, I suppose, but you can definitely mix it up. It doesn't have to all be gels. Do indeed mix up the textures and the tastes if you can.
Does this ever impact sleep? No, I tried it once or whatever, I couldn't sleep that night after I eat or whatever, fasting.
The question was if it impacts sleep in terms of does eating a lot of...
Fueling yourself up, carb loading in advance, whatever you're putting a lot of fuel into the body.
Maybe if you felt uncomfortable, if you'd kind of overloaded your stomach or ate too close to bed, perhaps. I don't know if you might have had a caffeine gel at night time. That maybe, no, okay. Generally, I wouldn't have thought so. The opposite is what I would have assumed, where people do get a little bit sleepy when they eat a little bit more carbohydrates. If you find that's not really the case for you, I'd probably get more of your calories in earlier in the day. And there is some research that suggests having something like a bowl of cereal or high glycemic index carbs an hour before bed can help you nod off a bit quicker. Kiwi fruit as well, weirdly enough. So maybe you add that into your carb loading repertoire. Do we have any other questions before I move on? Nope. Okie doke. Oops, we're going the wrong way. Okay, we're going to talk about protein. Athletes generally need more protein than non-athletes for a couple of reasons. You have to do normal day-to-day functioning irrespective all the time, rebuilding tissue, white blood cells, structural proteins, your skin, your hair, that's all made of protein. But when you're physically active on a consistent basis, you have to recover often, or you're potentially constantly in a state of recovery. And also, when you do a lot of exercise, you have a higher rate of muscle turnover. So basically, athletes need more protein because you're constantly building down and breaking muscle again, just at a bit of a higher rate compared to non-athletes. In terms of requirements, so normal gen pop, so not athletes like myself, this is where we would tend to live. If you're an endurance athlete, you're going to be around this bracket here, 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kg of body weight. If you're a power athlete, you're going to be slightly higher there. If you're injured, you're going to need significantly more. If you're plant-based, anecdotally, you can add 10% to that. So if you're a plant-based endurance athlete, you might be about 1.3 to 1.45 grams of protein per kg of body weight, roughly speaking. One thing to note, you need to make sure that the protein you're having is of good quality, okay? So I could have something like, let's say, just a bowl of peas, and there will be maybe 10 grams of protein in that, but it's not a complete protein. And I'm putting this slide up here in case there's any people that are plant-based in the audience. I'm not sure if there is or there's not, but maybe someone watching on the live stream or the recording, whenever you're watching, maybe some of you are plant-based. If you are not eating something like meat, fish, dairy, or eggs, they have full 20 amino acids, good amino acid profiles. You're looking for something like a soya-based product, tofu, edamame, soya yogurt, etc. If not otherwise, we want you to at least get about 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine in a protein sitting. So I'll explain that on the next slide, how you might go about that. But generally speaking, we can score proteins on their amino acid score using a PD-Cas value. This is way too much information for today, but I just thought I'd stick it in. Generally speaking, plant-based proteins score poorly, which is why we have to combine different types of plant-based proteins in a sitting for it to be of use to someone. So anecdotally speaking, you might have something like rice and grains, peas and corn, etc. As a general heuristic shortcut, Mexican food is class for plant-based people. Most Mexican dishes do have complementary proteins en masse. Otherwise, if you're standard omnivorous diet, eggs, chicken, fish, all that type of stuff, that'll generally tick the box. So again, just the reason it's important that your leucine threshold is hit. Leucine, just by the way, is one of the amino acids. It's one of 20. It's the key one in muscle protein synthesis, or the act of building muscle. If you don't hit 2.5 to 3 grams of leucine in a bout or in a sitting, you're not going to build that much muscle. Whey is a pretty potent source. So whey protein is generally a staple of most athletes because of this. It can help with muscle building very effectively. Notably, something like milk. Look how much milk you have to hit that leucine threshold. So it's a helpful recovery tool because there's lots of sugar in chocolate milk, for example. But you might need to have an additional protein source with this to launch a muscle building response. Similarly, you might have to have 5 eggs to hit that leucine threshold. So something like your whey protein, or something like a piece of beef or chicken or salmon of equal size, that's important. So I just wanted to stick that in there just so you can, I guess, get a feel for what kind of portion you might need. So peas will give you that leucine threshold, but they're not a complete protein, so you'd have to combine them with something else. Just an important thing here, most people, when they, I guess, in a first appointment with them, they will ask about the timing of protein after training, or they'll suggest that it's the most important thing to do right after a bout of exercise is to have a hit of protein. And that's not necessarily accurate. The idea of the anabolic window, or the muscle building window, it's reasonably outdated. We know that in terms of importance, it's most important that number one, you eat enough. So you meet your requirements, the 1.2 to 1.4 grams per kg body weight. The second thing we know is that it's important to get frequent hits of protein during the day. So if you're, let's say, anecdotally someone that intermittent fasts, maybe you have 2 or 3 meals a day, or you're someone who eats twice a day, or you're someone who eats 5 times a day, every time you get a hit of protein that satisfies that leucine threshold, you get this temporary bump in muscle building. So someone that has more frequent hits of protein throughout the day, quite literally speaking, builds more muscle during the day. So they recover an awful lot better. The thing to take away from this is if you're an athlete interested in recovery or you have a big training load, you want to include protein 3 to 5 times a day at consistent time points throughout the day to optimize your recovery. If you do this and you get the quality right, then you can worry about the timing after training. It's not the most important thing. So getting enough is the most important. Most people, thereabouts, just about get enough protein. For most athletes, not getting enough carbohydrates is a bigger problem. Do we have any protein questions while I'm on the topic?
Is there a limit to eggs? Like with cholesterol, how many you should have per week? So if you're trying to get protein through your eggs, should you limit them in any way?
Should we limit eggs, was the question. If you have high cholesterol, I'd probably say keep it to 2 a day. That's just what dietitians tend to say. However, I have read research papers where eggs have minimal to no impact on a lipid profile, and many more than 2 a day has no impact on one's cholesterol. That's a healthy population. I'd say for you, if that's an issue, keep it to 2 a day and focus on things like white meats, turkey. Do try some soya products, and that should be okay. 2 a day though, 14 a week. Do we have any other protein questions? All good? Okie doke. So again, just to point out, lots of people will come on board with the, I guess, expression that they'd like to build a little bit of muscle mass. And I'm talking about protein here for the last 5 or 10 minutes. And obviously protein is important for helping you build muscle mass and strength. You need to get enough. But also, if you're hoping to build some lean mass, you probably need to be doing something that stimulates that. So muscle is very costly to keep. It's got a high ESB bill associated with it. And you're not going to pack on the pounds of mass unless you give your body a very good reason to. So you probably need to be doing some resistance training, high gear efforts, hill sprinting, whatever it might be, or some gym work. It doesn't matter how much protein you eat. If you don't really do much exercise, all you're doing is giving yourself smelly farts, to be honest. That's about it. So you have to combine the two. If you don't have any history of kidney issues, you can take on board something like creatine monohydrate. That'll generally help the process of building lean mass, as would something like HMB. So those would be the 2 supplements we would put in play for someone looking to build some lean mass. It's not the first place we would start. And if you're thinking about taking this, do your bloods, get your kidneys checked, maybe get some advice first. That's the only contraindication there. But otherwise, just to say, again, it doesn't matter if you get your protein on the ball and you're not doing the gym work, you're not going to build any muscle mass. So that's important to acknowledge and establish. Should we be fat adapted? So this is something that pops up an awful lot in endurance communities, and I guess it seems like it's an appealing thing to do, and I'll explain these tables here in a moment and what they mean. But generally, we don't really want athletes to be fat adapted. While in theory you have an endless or infinite amount of energy on your body, it doesn't actually generally correlate to better performance. So these tables here come from a study done in race walkers, a different type of endurance athlete, but similar. When they fat adapt an endurance athlete or put them on a ketogenic diet, their VO2 max gets significantly higher, but when they time trial them and race them, they are significantly slower. And the conclusion was if someone's fat adapted, or they're on a keto diet, or they're generally low carbing it, they're much less efficient metabolically speaking. Generally 10 to 15% less efficient on average. And this is elite athletes, people who are generally very, very good at oxidizing fat and performing with glycogen depletion. So you could imagine the ramifications for not elite athletes. It's significantly bigger in theory. So if there's anyone here thinking, should I low carb it? You probably shouldn't. Stick to the carbs. It generally works out an awful lot better. Similarly again, fasted training. I'm not sure if anyone here does that. And just to explain, fasted training is exercising, generally in the morning, without eating anything or without having any carbohydrates on board. So it's fasted in the sense that there's no carbohydrates eaten recently. Think of fasted as a general lack of carbohydrates. A lot of patients and clients who are looking at losing weight will often put in fasted training into their approach, and some things that people say to me would be, if I train fasted, I'll burn more fat, therefore I'll lose weight. Is that something you guys have heard before? It makes sense. I guess I can see why people would think that, but the research tells us that the only thing that really changes weight loss or fat mass is a calorie deficit. Whether you're fasted training or not, it actually has no impact on body composition. So that study I've screenshot there was pretty recent. It was done in high-level athletes. So they looked at them taking on carbs versus not taking on carbs. And there was no difference in body composition, weight loss, performance. The fasted athletes didn't actually burn more fat. There was no difference at all. And I say that to point out that if you're doing fasted training to, I guess, help with weight loss, it's not going to work. On the contrary, there's an awful lot of research to suggest that doing fasted training or training with reasonably low levels of calories on board has a number of pretty significant health effects. For ladies and men, it can put an awful lot of pressure on your reproductive hormones, so estrogen, progesterone and testosterone. That can be tanked by doing frequent bouts of fasted training or training without carbs on board. There's a good chunk of research to suggest that it can also be pretty damning for your bone health. Again, not ideal. Osteoporosis and osteopenia is more common in cyclists because it's a non-weight bearing sport. So it's not really a bear you want to be poking too hard. Fasted training will do that. Another very, very common issue is iron deficiency. It's common in endurance athletes for a couple of reasons, but fasted training will be a big, I guess, protagonist there. When we do fasted training, you get a much larger inflammatory response to exercise. Basically, what ends up happening is you release much more hepcidin, and what that will do is it'll stop you absorbing iron in your gut. So if you're someone that struggles with iron deficiency, as many athletes do, training without carbs on board or training fasted, not helpful in your case, something to avoid. Do you have any questions on anything there in the last couple of minutes?
Yeah, a marathon runner. So you have to train in the morning, kind of hard to have breakfast beforehand because you can run around your stomach. So
Yeah.
what would you recommend in that case? Is there anything to eat to digest while you're exercising?
Yeah, good question. So the question was, how do you fuel in the morning if we're not supposed to be fasted? Basically, you do it in 2 hits. So if you're training in the morning, you basically pay for it the night before. Something like a bowl of cereal or a bagel or possibly a sandwich before you go to bed. Top up your glycogen stores. You're not going to wake up as depleted. Anecdotally, aim for about 0.5 gram per kilo of body weight. So for me, I'm 80 kilos. It's a fairly typical weight for a guy. That would be about a 50 to 60 gram bowl of cereal with milk, and that'll do the job. In the morning then, if let's say you're up at, I might just ask you, do you mind me asking what time you train in the morning?
So probably about like 6:30 or 7.
What time do you wake up at?
5 minutes before.
Okay. So if you're pinched for time, you get up in the morning, you don't really have that much time. Something like a sports drink, starting with a sports drink or taking it on the bike with you, at the very least fueling your session very, very well would be a way to go about it. And if you have the luxury of 30 minutes, something like a banana will do it. That has about a 30-minute, I guess, travel time between your mouth and your bloodstream. That will be an option. A slice of white toast with jam would be an option as well. So you want your quick carbs. Most people who train fasted or early in the morning generally do so because they're busy or they just don't have the time to wait. So those quick carbs in the morning, good way to go about it. So that's what I would do if I were you.
Thanks.
Do we have any other questions there before I move on? Nope. Okie doke. recovery then, how would we go about recovery? We focus on carbohydrates. So there's generally two phases to recovery. Your glycogen levels bounce back in a biphasic manner. There's a quick phase and a bigger, longer drawn out phase. If we can get someone to get high glycemic index carbs pretty much instantly, ideally within 20 minutes of finishing a workout, their glycogen levels top up way quicker. Do you guys know what glycogen is? I realize I've said that word a lot, I never explained it. Think of glycogen as your petrol tank. It's how you store carbohydrates in your body. Generally, we can say that the more full or less full someone's glycogen tank is, the more or less tired they will be, the more or less well they're going to perform an exercise, or the quicker or not they will recover from exercise. So it's like a proxy for how ready you are to train and how much you're going to get from your training. So we generally want your glycogen to bounce back nice and quickly. So we do that by taking on sugary carbs after training. If it's early in the morning, do include your protein there. So I would normally recommend someone have something like chocolate milk right after a workout and get a balanced meal within an hour post, aiming for 1 to 2 grams per kg of carbs. So to go back to your question earlier on there, if you were to imagine this is your day and you train there, you want not most, but a fair chunk of your calories centered around training to kind of pay for that work you're doing. So you take on a lot of the energy as and when you need it, in a sense. So recovery is pretty straightforward. It's basically a carb fest. Sugary carbs afterwards, reasonably balanced, large carb heavy meal an hour later, roughly speaking. That's kind of all there is to it. It can be pretty straightforward. Do you guys have any questions on recovery?
What happens if you have the balanced meal before you go out?
How long beforehand?
Half an hour.
So, good question. If you train and have a reasonably balanced meal, I presume meat, 2 veg spuds, something like that?
No, let's say your breakfast.
Okay, so if you have something like a bowl of porridge with your berries, your raisins and your whey, 30 minutes to an hour before you exercise, technically you might actually be training fasted, in a sense. So there's a big difference between eating something and absorbing it and it having an impact on your blood sugar and your glycogen. Something like this, because there's protein added to it, there's a bit of fiber there, and there, that's going to take much longer than an hour to go from your mouth through your stomach to be absorbed. So if it's early in the morning and you only have an hour, you're probably better off sticking to something like fruit, possibly something like a carb powder or the white toast. You'd need probably 2.5, maybe 3 hours for that to be fully assimilated and digested. So I guess just because it's gone in, it doesn't mean it's in your bloodstream, and that's kind of what we care about. Does that make sense? It's a good question though. Do we have any other questions on recovery before I move on?
Sorry, so are you saying then that a bowl of porridge is a very little benefit if you're going to exercise in an hour or so?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's all about it. But it does, but I'm sure it does give you energy after that hour. Like once you're on the bike, to haven't eaten the porridge, you are getting something, but you're an hour and a half, 2 hours into your cycle.
Potentially. When you exercise, your gut loses a lot of its function. Sometimes a lot of its absorptive capacity. It's probably not something I'd recommend. And I do get an awful lot of flack for this. I'm aware I'm a dietitian telling a room of people that porridge probably isn't brilliant first thing in the morning if you're cycling afterwards. I see the irony in that. But something like a bowl of Cocoa Pops is much more appropriate, to be honest, if you have an hour. That's what the research tells us. I'd hold off on the porridge until afterwards. Have it after your training.
What about with a squeeze of honey on it or something? Is it the honey that would give you that boost?
It's
as opposed to the porridge?
It's the fibre in the porridge that would slow it all down, regardless of how much honey you stick on it. So when you increase the complexity by adding fibre or fat, that, I guess, food matrix that you're eating, it all gets slowed down in terms of its release. So yeah, I would be suggesting Cocoa Pops or similar before training if you're short on time.
What about this?
One comment and one question. Basically, we go back to be child, eating a lot of sweets and keep eating like meat all day, so that's good news. Second one, if like myself and the guys in front of me, you're training for background from multiple sports, and you do 2 training sessions in a day, recovery comes continuously or on a treadmill,
Yep.
or not?
It's definitely not an easy thing to do, to train twice a day. And I guess if we look at sports nutrition guidelines, and someone who trains a reasonably abnormal amount twice a day it's not what a typical person would do, to be fair. Normal ideas of healthy eating guidelines become wildly inappropriate. They're no longer relevant. And I guess a lot of people struggle to make that jump. And what I would see is when an athlete tries to apply the food pyramid to Ironman training, those are the people who end up with REDs and osteoporosis, and possibly in some cases they end up exhibiting other symptoms as well. It generally doesn't go very well. But you can say, loosely speaking, that focusing on the higher glycemic index carbs around training, and let's say your lunch or when you're finished training for the day, use that as your opportunity to get your healthy fats and your fibre and your veggies in. I'm definitely not suggesting you don't eat fruit and vegetables. That's not what I'm trying to convey here, because you should do that still. But yeah, it can be tricky for sure. And you know, it wouldn't be atypical for an elite athlete's diet to be fairly heavily laden with Cocoa Pops and bananas and white breads and things like that. But that's what the sport demands, I guess. You know, sports nutrition isn't healthy eating guidelines. It looks almost nothing like that. If there was a Venn diagram, there'd be pretty much no overlap, not at all. I think there was a question there, was there?
So I was going to ask, how long does it take for the scoop of whey to get into your system?
60 to 120 minutes, depends on the person, but over an hour for sure. Okay, I shall move on. Sorry.
Can I ask, did you just say concentrate on high GI carbs before your event? And is it your view then that the exercise takes care of the very high sugar spike in blood?
So I guess if you have an average healthy person, very high sugar spikes probably don't happen anyway. Not very high. We wouldn't expect that. But generally, if you time it well enough, exercise will help with blood sugar control. In a bout of aerobic exercise, your blood sugar will generally steadily fall. If it's intense exercise, it can be a bit more complicated than that. But I guess to simplify it, I would go for the high GI carbs before and after. And I personally wouldn't be overly worried about if your blood sugar goes up or down or not around training. If you look, I'll digress here for a minute, but hypothetically, if you were a type 1 diabetic, I'd want your blood sugar to be around 8 to 10 millimoles before you exercise, which is double the normal fasting range. So it's not I guess, so tight that you have to keep your blood sugar low at all times. If you put a continuous glucose monitor on pretty much everybody in this room, their blood sugar would be pretty variable all the time. And it's more favourable if it's slightly high right before you train, because we know it's going to plummet downwards. So I wouldn't be worried about it, to be honest. Do we have any other questions before I move on? No? Okay. I'm going to very quickly talk about gut issues. I'm not going to ask if anyone here has gut issues because they can be quite embarrassing, but generally speaking, when you exercise, your fight or flight response activated when your muscles contract a lot, and that can cause a couple of problems for your stomach. The fight or flight response basically changes how much blood supply gets to your tummy, can change things like acid secretion and how quickly things move through your guts as well. That can make digestion tough going at the best of times. So when we look at literally what happens, gastric emptying, or how quickly your tummy empties things, can drop by about half. So anecdotally, cyclists who are bent over like this often experience GERD or reflux symptoms, and that can be a combination of these changes to stomach function or having things that are too complex before they train. So if you have a bowl of bran flakes, for example, and hop on the bike, if you're doing hard work, you're very likely to feel fairly unwell if you combine those two things. Very, very likely. If we want to help someone, I guess, minimize the amount of gut issues they get during a bout of exercise, we would suggest that they practice taking carbs during training. That forces blood supply back to your tummy, and that generally helps keep gut function in check. If you have a big race coming up or a sportive where you're going to need to get a high carb intake in, you probably need about 2 to 3 months to practice this, depending on how often you train. And again, I would start with something like an isotonic, build up to an aqua gel, build up to these more robust gels here, and then you're generally working towards 75 to 90 grams of carbs an hour. But that takes a while. If you're someone who doesn't take anything during training in general, and you try 90 grams of carbs an hour tomorrow, you'll definitely vomit, for sure. It's something you want to work steadily towards. But gut training is how we do that. And the two kind of key sessions during the week would be if you have got a long session, practice taking gels at every 30-minute intervals, and generally 2 fingers of fluids every 20 minutes is a good way to go about it. And if you're doing something like a tough session, like an FTP or a tempo effort, or I guess just high heart rates, practice taking gel when you're under peak amounts of pressure. Think of it as training stimulus. If you take those carbs when you're under the most amount of pressure, you're putting pressure on your stomach to, I guess, function under duress. That can bring about adaptive responses in your gut. So if you do get reflux issues, practicing in the tough sessions and the long sessions, that's how we kind of address that. And it can take a little bit of time to ameliorate that. And in terms of, I guess, a hierarchy of what's going to bother you or what's not going to bother you, liquids will generally be easier on the stomach than semi-solids, which will be easier on the stomach than solids. Anecdotally, you kind of know that already. If you don't feel great, you're much more likely to have a sports drink than, I guess, a big bowl of cereal or something more solid. But that's very, very evident in people who are actively exercising. And again, to minimize gut issues, we want to reduce the fiber and fat pre-training. Because not only are you going to be underfueled, you're also going to have a full stomach, which again opens you up to some problems, potentially. Do we have any questions before I move on?
Can I ask you chocolate bars?
I do like them. Ideally, probably, chocolate is mostly fat for a start. If you find that you get away with it when you're on the bike, go for it. It definitely wouldn't be my recommendation though. I would suggest you might get away with something like chocolate milk or a chocolate flavoured gel, if that's a thing. Robbie, do you stock chocolate flavoured gels? Maybe you should. I probably wouldn't recommend chocolate though during exercise. It's pretty high in fat, and in terms of risk, it does raise your risk of a gut issue, but I guess with all things, risk isn't an inevitability. If you find it's fine for you, fine for me, you know. But it generally wouldn't be on the race day guidelines, but it's very individual at the same time. I did have a client who used to eat spuds in races, so you know, whatever works for the person at the end of the day. Do we have any more questions here before I move on?
You had a word there,
Catecholamine?
Yeah.
Stress hormones, basically.
Can you swap maple syrup for gels?
Yes, you can. So the question was, can you swap maple syrup for gels? You can indeed, and I'll do you one better. I actually work with a pro cyclist who eats honey on the bike, pure honey, just like Winnie the Pooh. You can get sachets of honey.
And carb composition equally as good?
Pretty good. Honey and maple syrup are reasonably high in fructose. They wouldn't exactly have, say, the 2-to-1 ratio in something like high 5 or the 1-to-0.8 ratio in SIS. It wouldn't be far off of that though. Especially in honey, it's going to be closer to a beta fuel than anything else, if that works for you. I think they're called stinger gels, the honey ones, if you're looking for them. Do we have any more questions? Yeah, when we've loads.
Can you talk to it on, say, electrolytes if you're taking the gels and taking the salt tablets and that as well?
Definitely. That's actually an upcoming slide. I'll answer that in a couple of minutes.
You haven't mentioned nuts at all
Nuts.
in your diet.
So if I was to pick a food that's almost exclusively fiber and fat, it would be nuts. So I guess the right before training period of time and when you're training, that would be like the worst thing to eat. Definitely a good snack if you're finished training for the day or you're not exercising for a couple of hours. Do get them in. They are full of healthy fats and fiber and all that. But as an exercise fuel, woefully bad. Do we have any other questions before I move on? Okie doke. So, hydration. This is an interesting one. Generally, if you are under 65, your fluid requirements are 35 mils per kilo of body weight. If you're over 65, it's 30 mils per kilo of body weight. That's your baseline. That's what you need if you're not exercising. So I'll use me as an example. I'd need about 2.8 litres a day if I'm doing nothing, okay? If I was exercising, let's say I take myself as the average athlete. The average athlete loses 1.2 litres of sweat per hour. That's quite a lot of sweat. The sweat range varies from 400 to 5 litres an hour, 400 mils to 5 litres an hour. NFL players in Florida lose about 5 litres an hour. They're big lads in all fairness, but it's some going. We might get someone to do a sweat test if they were working with us. By the way, Dylan here, this is my protege sitting top right there. So myself and Dylan might get someone to do a sweat test. Basically, if you're doing an exercise bout, weigh yourself before and after the training session in minimal clothing. So do it at home, I suppose. Minimal clothing. And if you're going to eat or drink anything, make a log of it. What you're trying to find is how much weight have I lost in this session? And if you can work it out, you can generally get kilogram per hour. Most people will fall in and around here. Some people will be higher than this. So a high sweat rate is clinically classified as 1.8 litres an hour or higher, okay? The reason it's important to know your sweat rate if you're an ultra endurance athlete is we want to keep your fluid losses to less than 2% during an event. So again, I'm 80 kilos, so if I lose 2% of my weight, that's 1.6 litres of sweat. On average, that would only take me about 100 minutes. Most races last longer than 100 minutes, I think, for cyclists, right? Significantly longer. So if we're trying to make a hydration pattern or protocol for someone, we need to know their sweat rate so we can tailor how much do you need to drink during exercise to stay within 2% fluid losses. Generally, people on the bike can handle this much fluid, 400 to 700 mils per hour. So it's important to know this. This is a really easy thing to do, and kudos to anyone who can guess, but if you sail past the 2% dehydration mark, does anyone know how much of an impact that has on sports performance or finish times? A lot. Give me a percentage. Did someone say 2%? 2%? Anyone else want to hazard a guess? 50% now. No, you'd have to be fairly dry now for that. It's about 10 to 20% of a performance decline when you sail past 2% dehydration. So again, I recall watching the Beijing Olympics, watching the endurance events or the World Athletics Championships in Doha. All of, say, the race walks and the marathons, they were significantly slower because people were struggling to keep it inside those hydration guidelines. But you don't have to be in a hot country to suffer. If you're doing a 4 or 5 hour race and you're an average sweater and you can drink an average amount, you're very likely to supersede that 2%. Food for thought, something to look into, something to work towards. Just an example, if we're looking at an 80 kilo athlete with a 1 litre sweat rate and they can drink 500 mils per hour, how much would they need if they do a 3 hour bike? So they're 2.8 litres per day. They take in 1.5 litres on the bike. And to rehydrate, okay, I didn't mention this, but it was in the previous slide. If you're trying to rehydrate after you exercise, you want to replace about 1.5 times what you've lost. So again, knowing your sweat rate is important. If you can figure out how much weight you've lost in training, you know how much you need to drink. So I'll go back to our calculations here. Our 80 kilo athlete doing a 3 hour bike, 1 litre sweat rate, drinks an average amount, 6.2 litres of fluids that day to be adequately hydrated.
That's a lot of beers.
That's quite... Erdinger is an isotonic. There you go. It might make you a little bit sick, but that's some going. That's about 30 cups of tea. You know, that's a lot of tea. So it's important. A lot of people underhydrate or they don't get the rehydration part right. So if you're doing long bikes or you're doing kind of multi-stage races or you're competitive, you know, I don't know what level you guys cycle at, but this is something to do with sweat tests. You just need a weighing scales and basic arithmetic and you can kind of work out your requirements. Again, you'll get these slides. I'm easy to find if you want help with the numbers.
Just on the baseline litres, is that water from all sources, or is it everything you eat, fruit, vegetables, etc.? And is there always that debate?
So the question was the baseline requirements here. So this, before you exercise, is that just water or is it just liquids? The answer is no. So 2.8 litres, say for an 80 kilo athlete, that could be a litre of water, 8 cups of tea and a bottle of Coke Zero. In China, interestingly enough, I know we're far from China, but in China they eat 90% of their liquid because it's broth and it's soups and things like that.
That was my point in terms of, if you say you ate a lot of vegetables and fruit, like an apple, an orange, a salad, is that?
It's about 10 to 15% at most. You'd have to eat a fair amount of fruit though to be kind of up there. So I would say you'd be safe enough just drinking that, and whatever you get from your fruit is a bonus. Good question though. If you move to China though, numbers change. 1 cup of tea a day, sorted. So this very intimidating looking set of tables here, they actually do make sense. It took me about 4 months to figure out what these tables meant, but we got there. I'll explain it to you guys in about 2 minutes. I got a question about electrolytes. Should we aggressively replace electrolytes? The answer is no. The research on electrolytes shows that athletes who take electrolytes versus athletes who don't generally have no difference in performance. Not much of a significant difference in serum sodium levels. That's your most important electrolyte. And if we think about it clinically for a couple of minutes, maybe, I don't know if anyone here is a doctor or a healthcare practitioner, but if you look at the blood work of someone who's dehydrated, generally dehydration looks like high sodium levels and high urea. Most athletes can't drink their sweat rate. If you can drink 1.2 litres an hour when you're on the bike, that's very, very atypical. So most people get incrementally more dehydrated as they exercise, okay? So we can say that the average athlete, as they progress through a bout of exercise, their urea and sodium levels rise steadily or reasonably steadily, okay? The idea that we have to test our sweat for sodium levels and replace said sodium levels is becoming more and more considered not accurate and possibly even pseudoscientific. Replacing sodium sweat losses is considered to be a bit of a red herring. We care more about the sodium levels in your blood, okay? That's what's more homeostatically relevant. It's more important for your health and your bodily function that we focus on the sodium in your blood, not your sweat.
Sorry, are you saying that the sodium is increased because the water is decreased?
Yeah. So as you become dehydrated, think of it, I never have a good analogy for this, but you have a certain amount of fluid in your body in which there's a certain amount of stuff floating around. As you sweat, you lose more fluid proportional to the stuff in your blood. So when you become dehydrated, that stuff becomes more concentrated, basically. So when you get dehydrated, your electrolytes will generally become more concentrated because there's less stuff to dilute it.
So water is more important than the stuff?
Yeah, exactly. And we can actually model it. This was the first paper that did that. This was by A.J. McCubbin, al. 2023. They modeled the actual requirements for sodium replacement in very long bouts of exercise. It's totally dependent on how much of your sweat rate you can replace. So if we look at the bottom axis of all of these tables, 50, 60, 70%, I'll use an easy example. Let's say you lose a litre an hour. If you can only drink half a litre an hour, you're replacing 50% of your sweat losses. In my experience, most people are here or here. And if we look at this table here, or this side of the table, it tells us how much sodium do these athletes need to replace. If you're an average sweater and you can drink 500, 600 mils an hour, for exercise sessions up to 10 hours in duration, you realistically only might need 0 to 20% of your sodium losses. Roughly speaking, it might be one of these, maximum 2 an hour. I'm not sure if you guys ever use really heavy duty electrolytes. I probably can't name the brand because I get in trouble, but let's just say heavy duty electrolytes, not really a good idea. You generally want to stick between 0 and 200 milligrams. Anecdotally speaking, an isotonic is more than enough salt to keep you steady and within the sodium range for pretty much everybody. So high dose electrolytes, to answer that question there, hard pass. If we look at the average Irish person, and I suppose as a dietitian, you know, I see a mix of athletes and not athletes, the average person already eats almost twice as much salt as they need to. And it's a known cause of things like high blood pressure, kidney disease. It's a risk factor for stomach cancer. So when we apply this to sports nutrition, we only want to give athletes the minimum amount necessary. It doesn't make sense, potentially, nor is it safe to give people high dose electrolytes. Does that make sense? So the minimum amount, generally an isotonic. Anything stronger than that is unnecessary and potentially unhelpful.
Just to try and compare it to what you said into sort of a normal session or whatever. So normally before I go out, I take one of those SAS tabs, point of water, just knock it back and off the go, and then I just top up with water throughout the session. Is that kind of, you're saying there's enough in that to sustain you from doing anything else?
Yeah, pretty much. You might use a Lucozade Sport if it's a longer session, but that would legitimately be more than enough electrolytes. Or similar with a lot of these gels, they'll have isotonic equivalents of electrolytes in them. That's enough. Anything higher than 200 milligrams of sodium, then you can check, that's probably a little bit too high. So you want to keep it isotonic. It'll say isotonic. If it's isotonic, it has to say it on the pack. But yeah, that would do you.
What's the difference with it so far?
You just mightn't feel great. You can get headaches if you have sodium high or low. You might get a cramp. You might be more likely to have a cramp. There's no real, I guess, obvious symptoms. You might be very, very thirsty if your sodium levels are very high. Drinking would be a natural response to, I guess, replace that. But that would be about it. High bone natremia, which is very common in 24-hour events. Dizziness, crippling headaches, feeling a bit nauseous, weakness. Those would be symptoms of that. But for high sodium, not much bar what I just mentioned. Any other questions?
So just to be clear, are you saying you shouldn't continuously drink an isotonic solution during the training?
I'm saying if you're doing a long bout of exercise, an isotonic is the ideal thing to take. Continuously. You don't want anything stronger than that, basically. So there's products in the market that have 1,000, 1,500 milligrams or 500 milligrams of sodium. That's far too high. So anything on the shelf there, pretty much A1. You don't need to add to that, I guess. Any other electrolyte questions?
When you're training and so on the bike, you've got 2 bottles.
Yeah.
Your bottles are 700 mil, say roughly 710 mil, and you're doing a 4-hour training session that has a good bit of climbing. What's your best strategy for those bottles? Are you better having some with carbs, some with electrolytes, or what's the best way? You're obviously going to need to top up those bottles over the 4 hours, so it's not an event, there's no fuel stop. Mm-hmm. What's the best way to use those bottles over a 4-hour period?
So the question was, if you have a 4-hour bike to do and you have 2 750 ml bottles, what should you ideally stick into them? If you were a client of mine, I'd suggest you get 3 of those beta fuel sachets and put 1.5 into each bottle. And that's it. And when you find a shop, fill them with Lucozade Sport, and that's you sorted, pretty much. So the idea that one bottle should be electrolytes and one should be carbs, it should be both. So all in each bottle all the time. No plain water would be an easy way to memorize that. Any other questions before I move on? Okay. So I did get asked to look at some female specific stuff. There's an awful lot of hype around altering your training based on times of the menstrual cycle, and to be honest, there's actually no evidence for doing that. I wanted to point that out first and foremost, because you will see an awful lot of people promoting that you should change the intensity or type of exercise you do. There's no research that really supports that. I just wanted to put that in there. It's not a nutrition thing, it's just, I guess, myth busting 101. So that's not something you need to do. You don't need to change it around your menstrual cycle. One thing that does come up for an awful lot of athletes, and it can be somewhat debilitating if the symptoms pop up, it can make exercise, I guess, highly undesirable. We can minimize the damage, or at least the symptoms to a degree. An omega-3, a magnesium supplement, and B vitamins. That's kind of all you can do from a dietary perspective to minimize PMS symptoms. Anecdotally, a high fiber diet will also help. Unfortunately, if you're prone to PMS, it's kind of a multidisciplinary thing. Maybe programming rest days around that, watching your stress levels, ticking those boxes. That's really all you can do. There's not an awful lot else, at least that I'm aware of, that's relevant in that case. What does come up quite a lot is athletes do mention that they're hungry quite a lot in the luteal phase of their menstrual cycle, or the second half. And that can be legitimately accurate, because your requirements can increase by the equivalent of almost 3 pints of Guinness in the second half of your menstrual cycle. And if you don't increase your intake to match that, you might find you're very, very hungry. So if you track your cycle or you keep tabs of that, the Flow app is pretty good for this. If you notice a pattern that you might snack more late at night, or you're very hungry, or you're finding portion control hard going, and it happens to be in the second half of your luteal phase there, maybe you just need to actually legitimately eat a little bit more at meal times to get better appetite control and overall satiety. So to reiterate, the metabolic changes and the increases in calorie requirements there in the second half of your luteal phase do warrant higher amounts of energy intake, and that should be acknowledged. 500 calories would be a reasonably tough hour of training for most people. So it is an added stressor all by itself. This is something that comes up quite a lot. Again, you will see an awful lot of people talking about menopause-specific nutrition on Instagram in particular, or social media or online. There's not really an awful lot of very evidence-based advice for menopause specifically. There are increased risks with menopause, and you deal with the risks if they pop up or when they pop up. The most common one would be higher levels of cholesterol. If you have a question, I'll definitely answer clinical questions as well while we're here. But high cholesterol can be something that pops up as estrogen levels drop. And if you are finding that your doc has said, listen, you need to cut out the butter or the chocolate here, something like Benecol can be really helpful for bringing that cholesterol down, or following a Mediterranean style diet. Okay, so that would be one thing to look at. Relevant for sports would be bone health. So again, if you're a cyclist and you're not doing lots of weight-bearing exercise, your bone health might be more likely to be dropping. If you're menopausal or postmenopausal, that's where your bone mineral density is most likely to drop. So if you haven't done a DEXA scan and you're in that phase of life, it will be something to look into, especially if you generally don't do weight-bearing exercise. A lot of my patients and my clients would be osteopenic or osteoporotic, who would be cyclists. And if you're in that, I guess, phase, it's important to know that, because there's a couple of requirements that change here, like calcium, vitamin D, getting your vitamin K is important, and even knowing that doing things like fasted training is going to aggravate that as a risk factor. It'd be important to cut that type of stuff out if it's relevant for you. Final two things that can change with menopause, and again, if you have a specific, do ask: sleep quality and stomach problems. If you have some sleep issues, handy fact, 2 kiwis before you go to bed is a really handy way to improve your sleep quality by about 10%. So that's one thing. And if you wanted to try something else, you can try a magnesium supplement. They generally help people nod off a little bit more effectively. Last one there is some stomach issues. IBS symptoms tend to pop up around menopause, which can make fueling during exercise very, very hard, because a lot of the sports nutrition products are fructose, which generally don't go well for IBS candidates. So something like maltodextrin, you can buy it online, maltodextrin. It's non-fermentable. If you're having some stomach issues or you find that most products are hard going, that's probably what I would stick with. Does anybody have a female specific question for me? I was asked today to stick them in the slide, so that's why they're scanned. I did them like 2 hours ago. Does anyone have a female specific question for me? Robbie? Okay, I'll move on. I'm nearly finished.
Sorry, just on cholesterol, it's not female specific, but on the cholesterol, you were saying, for instance, drink chocolate milk or something like that after a session. Is there any alternative that you could use? Like, obviously chocolate milk would be good for someone with high cholesterol. You know, what alternatives would there be? Or?
So I suppose to answer your question there, the question, if I rephrase it, is dairy negative for cholesterol?
Yeah.
The answer is no, actually. So milk, yogurt and cheese, the lipids in that generally don't cause negative issues with cholesterol profiles. It's more so things like butter and cream. That'd be your problem. So I wouldn't anticipate that you drinking chocolate milk after a long bout of exercise to aggravate or interfere with cholesterol management. It's the butters and the creams, unfortunately. But that's a common myth. So yeah, you can belt away.
Not cheese.
Not cheese. Cheese is okay. Yeah, doesn't negatively impact lipid panels. Not suggesting you have a pizza every day. When we look at portions of cheese, it's 2 thumbs. It's a matchbox. So that's what I'm referencing here. Eat a pizza every day, you may very well have high cholesterol, depending on the toppings you stick on it. Do we have any other questions there before I move on? No? Okie doke. Okay, have you guys ever heard of Informed Sport? You've probably seen the logo. A couple of the supplements there will have the little top left logo there on it. If you're competing in an event where you can be drug tested, it's probably important to know about this. Interesting stats, if I'm going to recall them accurately here. Sport Ireland actually did a study on, say, contaminants in products in the EU, including Ireland. And the stats tell us that for doping cases, people who get banned from sport for doping, about 8% of them, 6 to 8%, are from nutrition products that are tainted with either steroids or amphetamine derivatives. If you want to avoid consuming amphetamines, which is generally a wise thing to do, you can look up Informed Sport. Let's say you want to get creatine and you want to know that there's not going to be rat poison in this. If it's on Informed Sport, it'll have a couple of brands that are batch tested. Pick one of those brands, look for that, buy it online, buy it in store. That's generally the best way to go about it. You can look up carb powders, multivitamins, electrolytes, vitamin Ds, all of that type of stuff. If I'm working with a professional athlete or any of the candidates I have going to Paris this year, there's a legal requirement that they actually pay credence to this. And as a practitioner, if I advise a supplement and it's not batch tested, I also get in lots of trouble. So you have to be really, really careful with that. The contamination rate is uncomfortably high. So I would stick to an Informed Sport thing, unless it's something pharmaceutical like a Centrum or Ferrograd or a high-dose vitamin D like Altavita. Do check otherwise. Do you guys have any supplement questions for me?
Just in general, they're kind of viewing, so like things you go into, say, a home environment, it's just a barrage of supplements that you're faced with. So, I mean, like at the moment, I'm kind of taking glucosamine, was supposed to be good from joints, fish oil, turmeric, things like that. Am I just throwing money down the sink, or are they doing any benefit whatsoever? You know?
You may not enjoy my answer here. Glucosamine and chondroitin, I'll start with that. That's only ever been shown to be effective if you have osteoarthritis. For anyone else, it doesn't reliably help with joint anything. It could be placebo at most. Fish oils, probably fine. Generally speaking, they're fine. 7C's is a reputable brand. Minami is a reputable brand, or Somega. What else did you say you were on? Turmeric. Turmeric can be good. If you're looking for a reasonable and Informed Sport covered turmeric supplement, Kinetica have collagen shots that have turmeric in them. If anyone here has a connective tissue injury, that may help your recovery. So I wouldn't routinely recommend turmeric as a supplement. Use it in your diet for sure. There's some cases of hepatotoxicity in the States, people taking high dose turmeric. It can be hard on your liver, and it's not necessarily evidence-based for most things. Maybe long COVID, if you have it, you might use turmeric there, but that'd be about it.
But you're saying there about osteopenia and osteoporosis.
Yeah.
Would you recommend all cyclists take vitamin D?
I would, actually. So if you wanted to get your bloods done, you can look for your blood report. For athletes, which if you train frequently on purpose, you're technically an athlete, I'd like your vitamin D requirements or your vitamin D levels to be at 70, is it nanomoles? 75 on your blood report. That's what you're aiming for. If you're below that, I would take vitamin D. There's no kind of hard or conclusive recommendations for athletes, but some research papers suggest that vitamin D requirements in athletes are up to 5 times higher than the RDA. So yeah, I would recommend it. Get your bloods done. If you're below 75, take a supplement. 1,000 IUs is a good kind of floor to start with. If you're osteopenic or osteoporotic in particular, calcium requirements are the big one there, as that will determine bone mineralization or remineralization. You're looking for about 12 to 1,500 milligrams a day. That's a good litre and a bit of milk. So the calcium needs are the equivalent of 5 portions of dairy if you have low bone mineral density. And I might suggest that you aim to include vitamin K rich foods, as that will help deposit calcium into your bones. Kale 2 or 3 times a week will cover your needs there. So that's about all the considerations for that. Any other questions for me today? Because we're on the last slide.
On the magnesium, what dose should you take for helping with sleep, and will that help with cramps?
So magnesium dose is about 3 to 350 milligrams. It probably won't help with cramps, to be honest. Muscle cramps are only associated with magnesium deficiency, which is actually pretty rare in Western civilizations. So unless you eat nothing with fibre in it or no veggies, you're probably not cramping because of magnesium deficiency.
What does cause cramps mostly?
Probably ask a physio. It's more of a physio thing. If you get cramps on or off the bike, it's generally muscle fatigue. If you get twitching, in that your muscles twitch and they then subsequently cramp, that can be an iron or B vitamin deficiency. If someone is having cramping issues, you look at their hydration. Are they having too much or too little salt in their diet? If you're getting dizzy, sometimes you get orthostatic hypotension, as in you get dizzy when you stand up. Maybe it's electrolytes or specifically sodium and hydration. But I generally wouldn't jump to a supplement if someone is having cramp problems. I'd look at their training, chat with their coach, and maybe see a physio.
Creatine, would you only take it after exercise or take it regularly?
So if you're going to take creatine, it's important to know that creatine takes about 4 weeks to actually do anything when you start taking it. So it's something you take on a daily basis, on a pretty much long-term basis. Like if you're someone with no renal issues, you can take creatine every day until the day you die, and that's safe to do. So I would take it on training and non-training days religiously, 5 grams a day.
You mentioned beetroot earlier.
I did. I said I'd come back to beetroot and I never did. Fair point. If you wanted to get a handy jump in your VO2 max, you can get little beetroot shots. I don't know if you guys, Robbie's getting me a beetroot shot there. If you all turn your attention to Robbie there as he walks over to me with a beetroot shot. Man, thank you. So one of these boys here, if you're going to do an event and you want to perform pretty well, the dosing regime is you would take 2 of these for about 5 days before your event and 2 on race morning, around 2 hours before you head off. What beetroot does is it'll widen your arteries. So let's say your arteries are like that. You take all the beetroot, all the nitrate makes your arteries go like that, a little bit wider. That helps with blood flow and oxygen supply to your muscles. So when you take that beetroot, you get a bit of a temporary bump in your VO2 max, and also helps with muscle contractions being a bit more efficient. The upshot is you'd have to take about 12 of these before a race you care about. If you don't like beetroot juice, which is very understandable, you can use citrulline malate instead. 6 grams a day, same dosing period, and it'll do the same thing.
What malate?
Citrulline, CIT or ULLINE.
You mentioned about the carbohydrates on the cycle for that and what to take. What about protein?
Protein on the bike?
Yeah.
Unnecessary. Unless you're doing something very, very ultra. Like I have an athlete that's doing this race in South Africa. It's on a mountain bike. It's about 8 hours a day. We'll have him taking BCAAs during the event 2 times over an 8-hour stage just to hit that leucine threshold I mentioned earlier on. But otherwise, it's never something I'd routinely do. There's just no requirement to do so.
But if you were on an endurance ride for 8, 12, 14 hours, would you?
Yeah. So if it's that length and it's true ultra endurance, what I've done with some athletes in cases like that is we'll use things like the Kinetica shakes, the ready to drink shakes, because they don't need to be refrigerated. So they might take that as a liquid source every 4 to 5 hours. And that's generally fairly well tolerated. It goes down pretty well for people. So that's an option. Or in those very, very long races, people will often eat solid food or actually stop to have a meal. So that's something that we'd also do as well. Do we have any other questions today? No? We're all questioned out. Okay, well, thanks for listening, guys. I know, God, I went about half an hour over time, so apologies, I suppose, but thanks for listening.